What's up YouTube? Today's video we're going to go over the build of the week in PoE and pretty much my take or my friend's take on the build of the week. Now I was planning to showcase this build, but somehow GGG or whoever was making the build of the week video kind of beat me to the punch somehow. But they did a very different version that's very unique, so you should go check it out. So this is the build of the week. Build of the week is an Oscar-winning Emmy-nominated series made by GGG that features some of the new builds that they find on Path of Exile forums and explain it in a very cinematic and visceral way that makes you want to play the build. Now, a lot of these build of the weeks, I have looked at them in the past, and they've kind of been like mid, like not very good, not very great, but it demonstrates an amazing concept. Just look at the cinematography. This is why this build of the week series has probably won like 5 or 6 Oscars in the past 2 years, but basically, the build of the week goes into very good detail and explanation about how the build works. It's very cool concept. But a lot of times you don't really get to see how the build actually functions on like the hard boss fights. So my main goal with doing this is to try to show you what it looks like on the Uber bosses. Now my variant is a little bit different from what they do. And when I saw like the mapping footage of it, it actually looked really like it doesn't look very good. I don't really know why it doesn't look better. Maybe it's the movement speed or I don't really know. It just doesn't look great. But the build is not too bad. I don't think it's bad at all. So you can see here, this is my character. Now I am borrowing my friend's gear. So you can pretty much just shield charge through everything. You have Profane Blue. And this is a very different variant because his is like Inquisitor. And I do have a mapping version with Death's Oath if you want to check it out. But basically, how does this build actually work? We'll get into it. And then, well, first off, you probably want to see what it actually looks like on the Uber boss fight. Now, for Uber bossing, I was only able to do Eater of Worlds. I didn't really have that much time. But I did have to make the build a little bit tankier. If you do look at this build of the week that GGG released, it has no spell suppression and no maximum resist. And pretty much, the character's going to be dead. You can't just use spell block of Glancing Blows on doing Uber bosses. It's never ever going to work. Then they did go of an on-hit version of Volconus, and this version that I'm currently using does revolve around poison. I do think that poison is probably like the holy grail of bossing. It feels good. You don't really need to always be on top of the boss to do damage. And here you can see this is Eater of Worlds. Now I'll probably just go over like a little bit of the fight for people who are wondering how this actually goes. So Eater of Worlds, as many people may know, is a very mechanical fight. I do think that Eater of Worlds you can pretty much do without ever taking really any sorts of lethal damage, even without having any defenses. And pretty much, as you can see, this build that I'm currently playing does have Cyclone and is linked to Awaken cast on channeling. And you'll see that there's also Blade Vortex. And all of this is linked to the Covenant. Now, what the Covenant does is it allows us to get a lot of single target. And it has added Chaos damage level 29, I think, or 30. So basically, the build actually does decent amounts of damage, but you'll see later on that this build also has the same problem that a lot of melee builds actually have, is that in order to do maximum amounts of damage, you have to be within melee range of the boss. And as you can see right now, it's kind of hard. Like the boss does a lot of stuff, it's constantly moving, but the damage is there. If I had to guess the damage, it's probably around 5 million DPS or so, because the boss is dying relatively fast. It's not like a world beater in terms of how fast it is, but it's not too bad. Now, something you may notice on this boss fight that you may be wondering, what happens when I hit the ball? Now, this build has a very interesting concept where you have an amulet, which makes it so that debuffs on you expire 100% faster. Now, what this means is that when you actually play it and you run into a ball, it's actually a debuff on you, and when it fully expires, you drown. Now, the funny thing about that is that when you run into the ball, the duration you have to stay within the ball before you drown is really short. So this actually makes the fight incredibly difficult compared to what one may be used to. If you even touch the ball for a split second, you could instantly die. And that's something that's really annoying, since we're actually kind of pseudo melee on this fight as we're cycloning. Now, if you don't have cyclone, you actually do a lot less damage. And I do think that this build can do to fight Deathless. I think I only died one time on this. Maybe it's time to skip forward a little bit because it actually does take a while. Now, for anyone wanting any tips, always flame dash through the boss, especially if you can get good at the timing. It does allow you to have pretty much more damage opportunities, and always watch out for the tentacles that you can see right there. Dash through the boss. It is kind of a bit of an acquired skill. And this also goes into the fact how PoE is pretty much a game where you do get a lot better on the boss fights. And I feel like the boss fights where you start being really bad at the beginning and then you get really, really good at the boss fight later on, it feels really good. It feels like you're progressing. You can feel like the boss fight is actually fair because you were just bad at the boss fight before. And you can see here, this part is all about patience and trying to wait it out. It'll always do a starfish pattern right here after you finish the consume phase. But basically at this time, you can see that we're running into the issue where this build is a pseudo melee build because you with twisters need to be pretty much on top of the boss in order for us to do maximum damage. So you can see here the boss is still not dead and we're still going to do a lot of intermission phases. It's kind of crazy, right? The first 50% of the boss went down super, super fast, and towards the end it just becomes a horrible, horrible shit show. There's too many balls everywhere. And then we dash to the boss again, and then we do another intermission phase. I think this boss fight probably took like 8 minutes or so. So we dash to the boss again. But overall, the fight did feel pretty clean. It did take me quite a few attempts to get this nearly deathless. So you can see how fast right there I almost drowned again. Now, overall, I do think this build can do all of the Uber bosses. And I think Cyrus won't even be that big of an issue because the build does do decent amounts of damage. And you can do damage from relatively range. So this fight kind of reminds me of a gauntlet fight because pretty much at this point, anything that touches me is going to be death. Now for this fight, I did spec into going 100% spell suppression. I also use a Topaz Blast. As you can see, it's actually popped right now, or you can't really see it. It's pretty much just because without the Topaz Blast, any of these little tentacles even spawning out of the ground will one-shot me. Let's see, are we almost at the end? Is the boss almost about to die? So we have to do another intermission phase, and man, intermission phase after intermission phase after intermission phase. I will actually wonder how bad Searing Exarch is going to be. But as I say before, it's all about patience. Wait for that starfish pattern. And make sure. So look how many balls are chasing me. This is actually... Oh my goodness. Do I actually ever gem swap to put in culling? Because it's definitely within culling. Oh, I finally did it. And there we go. But let me know down in the comments below if you want to see me do all of the Uber bosses on this setup. But let's go straight into exactly how this build actually works. So the build revolves around Sakawal's Flock Helmet, which triggers level 20 Twister when you gain Avian's Might or Avian's Flight. So this duration, Avian's Might has a certain cooldown to it. So you can see here, the cooldown is actually 0.5 seconds. And you can see here, this is Avian's Flight, Avian's Might. It triggers back and forth. So what aspect of the Avian does is it has 2 buffs. And when it alternates back and forth, the helmet will cast Twister every time we gain Avian's Might or Avian's Flight. So to put it simply, this build revolves around reducing your duration so that Avian's Flight and Avian's Might can switch back and forth as much as possible. So the way we do this is we actually lower the duration with Sakawal's Boots and Gloves. So for Sakawal's Gloves, we have minus 1.93 seconds to Avian's Might. And this one is minus 1.9 seconds to Avian's Flight. And what this means is that we can actually switch back and forth super, super fast by taking reduced duration on the tree and also getting reduced duration on our gear. We have 60% reduced duration from Warp Timepiece, Time Clasp, and Time Clasp. So 2 Time Clasp, Warp Timepiece. And this is very similar to the Vol Lightning Strike Hateforge build. And then we have the 25% on the tree for 85% reduced skill duration. But that's not it. We are also able to link less duration and Swift Affliction on where Aspect of the Avian is. A lot of people don't really know. But you can see Aspect of the Avian actually has 2 links on there right there. The green and a red link. And this is actually linked to Swift Affliction and 2023 less duration. So we have, this thing has, what's it called, 25% less duration of supported skills. And this is 60% less skill effect duration. So that actually comes out to a lot of reduced duration. So then you can multiply it with reduced duration. And then the less duration, and then we have a number here, which is around 0.069 seconds duration of each buff. Now, so this build variant is a little bit different than the one. It's not on hit. This one is actually stacking poisons with twisters and utilizing a cultist to maximize damage. Now, the reason why you want to be a cultist is purely because you have this thing right here, which helps with your clear a little bit. And then this thing right here applies additional curse or blasphemy, temp chains, which helps their poison duration. And then we also have Despair. And then we also have Void Beacon, which lowers their chaos res. And then we also have Withering Presence, which gives us more chaos damage and allows us to inflict stacks of Withered on the debuffs on the enemy. Now, This build for the tree, it's kind of a cookie cutter tree. We're trying to get spell suppression. I did have to change up the build a little bit. The only places you can really get spell suppression on the tree is pretty much down here. So we're taking this right here, and then we have this spell suppression cluster over here. And since we're already going down to reduce skill duration, I am taking some spell suppression nodes here with Mage Bait and right here. So all in all, this actually lets us get 100% spell suppression, even though we have no spell suppression on our gear at all. The Covenant, this one right here, we don't have spell suppression on our shield. We technically could get spell suppression on the shield. And then we have this gloves and helmets, which are pretty much mandatory. So really nowhere you can really fit spell suppression except on the tree. Now we do use a large cluster chaos jewel. This is pretty much standard if you ever play Poisonous Concoction. It gives you chaos damage. And then this one right here is actually the big no. Increased duration of ailments on enemies. Now something you want to know is that you don't want to get any increased duration on a tree. I accidentally specced into increased skill effect duration, and specking into this node is actually really bad. As you can see here, look right here how fast these buffs switch. As soon as you take this node, even though this node's a lot of damage, you can see how slowly the twisters go, right? Or wait, did it actually go slower? Maybe we need to log out and in to see it. But when I tested it out, it was a lot slower than before. So make sure you have no skill effect duration anywhere, or it's going to slow down a lot. So you can see it kind of goes like that. And once you unspec out of it, you'll see that it's a lot faster, right? So make sure you don't have accidentally take any skill effect duration like I did. Now, Doriani's Jewel is used for extra ES buffer. It does help out a little bit in helping you survive that one-hit damage. Now, chance to poison is also huge. We are anointing Toxic Strikes down here, which is 15%. And then we have right here, this is 10% and 15%. So 25 plus 15 is 40. And then we have another 25 right here. And then we have a little bit more on Herald of Agony. And then the Divergent quality also gives us more chance to poison. So overall, we can see that the Twister actually has, I think, 109% chance to poison, which is really important because we want 100% chance to poison. Now, we are taking a bit of an aura cluster. This allows us to fit in 2x Blasphemy, Temp Chains and Despair, Herald of Agony, and Aspect of the Avian. Now, a big problem with this build and why I do think that it's kind of meh is the fact that you don't have any defensive aura. So I think if you could get a Despair on his Sackawall's Winds and Temp Chains, that might be the best. And that will allow us to run a Determination or something like that. We are running a Vitality aura. What Vitality allows us to do is get some life recovery back. We get a life gain on a hit, and there's so many tornadoes that get shot out. We get damage, leeches life. And then a life recovery from Flash also helps out a little bit, especially since we're using this 5 or 4 life Flash setup for doing the Uber bosses. Now, in terms of item, this build is incredibly item dependent in terms of uniques. You really don't have that much choices for what kind of gear you can use. The Sackawall's block is what allows us to actually do all of our damage, and this is what spawns the tornado, so it's actually linked to increased duration, awaken unbound ailments, awaken deadly ailments, and awaken GMP. Now, there is some line of reasoning that you can use slower projectiles, and that will allow you to get more hits out. It's kind of like a shotgunning of sorts, kind of similar to slower projectiles in Spectral Helix. Now, this build does use a Covenant, and you could also use Death's Oath for single target for map clearing. I do think it's a little bit better. So you just run around the map, and it's actually a pretty good clear style, and it's definitely pretty smooth to play with. So you can use this Death's Oath thing instead of Covenant. Covenant is pretty much a bossing chest piece. Now, Olesa's Delight is the Maven Belt. So instead of Frenzy charges, we gain Affliction charges, and this allows us to get 8% more damage over time. Now, the Dagger is being used so we can Cyclone, and this gets us hits can't be evaded. So we can always hit the enemies that apply Withering Touch and then proc Awaken Cast while channeling. And the shield is, we could definitely get a max res shield, but it does have +2 frenzy charges, and it does give us a little bit of resist. But I think the important part about it is you watch Socketed Gems have 30% increased reservation efficiency. You could also technically put Aspect of the Avian on the shield. And I did see the person that originally made the build of the week had this quality thing on the shield so that his support gems have extra quality. That does help out a little bit on Swift Affliction and less duration support. But I do think that the main weakness of this build in the end is definitely their survivability issue. Even in the build of the week, It literally has no spell suppression, no max res, and only glancing blows, 64% spell block. So the build's pretty much going to die. Now, in this version, it's a little bit better. I do think that you could probably drop the Covenant and maybe go... You could definitely probably go Brass Dome if you want to be tankier. You have +2 max res on the shield, and then you have 82% max res. And then you also have 100% spell suppression nearly, which should make the build feel a lot tankier. And if you run Determination, you get a Despair or Temporal Chains gloves. Then you would be having a lot of armor with Brass Dome. I do think that's the best setup. And then you can run Cast 1 damage, take a Molten Shell, which is completely broken. I do think the damage for this build is probably around 5 to 10 mil DPS, but you pretty much need to be on top of the boss to do optimal damage. So in a sort of way, it is a melee build. So because all the tornadoes spawn where you are. So if you're not on top of the boss or you're not on top of the mobs, the tornado will have to travel far away and you won't get the shotgunning effect. If you stand directly on top of the mob, then you will have the shotgunning effect. So overall, the build is pretty nice to play. I do think that this build is more mapper than anything else. You can do all of the Uber bosses on this poison setup, but you will need to play well. It's not really going to be a build where you just face roll everything. And Uber Elder, Uber Eater of Worlds are definitely doable so far as I've tested it out. But I haven't tried out the other ones. Maybe Uber Cyrus will be done. And let me know down in the comments below if you want to see like a full bossing compilation with this. But it is a very, very interesting build concept. And I do think the damage uptime is not the worst. It does allow you to run around in circles and you still do some amounts of damage. You just don't do the maximum amount of damage if you were cycloning on a mob or something like that. And reduced skill duration is always something pretty cool. Theoretically, you might be able to use Lightning Warp, and it could be a very, very fast movement skill. But this build does have Shield Charge, which does feel very good. Maybe we can test that out. But overall, reduced skill duration is king. So you can see here you have the -4 seconds roughly on a duration. And you have the reduced duration from our uniques. And then 25% reduced skill duration on the skill tree. And then lastly, we have the 95% less duration from the tree and the gems. So overall, very, very cool concept. It's kind of interesting how Path of Exile somehow chose this as the build of the week at the same time as I was going to try out my friend's gear and try out this build. But hopefully this concept makes sense to you and maybe you can try it out. I do think that mapping with it is a lot better than whatever they showcase on the build of the week. I'm not really sure why the build of the week actually looks so slow, but maybe they didn't really invest that much into movement speed or something like that. Wait, let me see. So like, when you look at this, it just looks... Wait. It's actually crazy. If you look at this build of the week, right? They actually sometimes look like they zoom out more in the game. I do think the main problem with the build that this guy is playing with is that he doesn't actually have shield charge. Now, if you ever don't play with shield charge, that's all you need to know about the build. I guess he has Lightning Warp for movement skill, but he's not really casting it that much. But anyhow, let me know down in the comments below which version you like more and if you would ever try this build out. I'm not really sure how expensive the pieces actually are. Well, you could just check it out, right? How much do you think this pair of gloves are? Oh, I don't even have a Awakened PoE trade. But I can see the pieces of gear being very, very expensive since this thing actually has a huge Divine roll. But thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you find more Mirrors, Divines, and Exalted Orbs than me. And see you next time. Bye!